It has been such an amazing conference, and we are going to close out the talks here at the Lunar stage with Savva Kerdemelidis. Yes, give him a round of applause. He comes on stage. We got overconfident.
Guys, all right, yeah, thanks for hanging out until the end. So, but hopefully you guys might find this kind of interesting. So I'm from an area of crypto, it's called DeSci. Has anyone heard of DeSci? A few people? Okay, so yeah, basically DeSci is looking at how do we fund science in a way that helps solve a lot of the current problems with science. That we're generally interested in the funding side of things. There are other areas of DeSci which are more about publishing and things like that. But today we're going to be talking about funding science, or basically medicines, as a public good. So public good medicine, hyperserts or retroactive public goods funding. So there we got someone in the corner. Yeah, all right, cool. So it's basically, yeah, that's right. Okay, that one. Okay, cool. Well, so at the moment, with healthcare, we've got this massive crisis going on, particularly in the States. There's basically, it's over 20% of US GDP is being spent on healthcare, and you've got like an aging baby boomer population. So yeah, and also essentially the prices that people are paying to get healthcare, like their health insurance, is rising faster than their wages, and it's estimated that like they might exceed you might be paying all of your wages and paying for medicines. Also, at the same time, making new drugs is getting more and more expensive over time, and part of that is basically to do with the fact that the pharma companies are always trying to find new patentable molecules, and there's only like so many things that basically we can take in the human body without killing us. And so as a result, like it's getting more and more expensive. It's called Eroom's law. Basically, it's Moore's law in reverse, where drugs are getting more and more expensive over time. And as I was saying, like there's extreme financial toxicity. Like new drugs are over 200 grand on average per year. If you get cancer in the US, 42% of cancer patients will lose everything they own within 2 years. Medical debts are the main reason for general bankruptcies in the States. And often a lot of the new drugs are not found to be any more effective than the old drugs. So not a lot of innovation going on. And also there's not a lot of bargaining power for companies basically to try and get the prices down, just because things are so expensive to produce. And particularly outside of the US, it just means that we can't afford the new drugs. And so there's this incentive problem basically with drug development at the moment, where drug companies will not fund clinical trials for what they call generic drugs or off-patent drugs, because there is no way that they can get a profit out of them. So, not to get all controversial, but, you guys might have heard of ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, things like that. People talking about how that's a COVID treatment. So this sort of thing basically ends up creating this big problem where these things get publicly funded, but the clinical trials are too small. Everyone's sort of arguing, and basically private pharmaceutical companies will not touch that area. They don't get into it because there's no way for them to make any money out of it. So this is the main cause. They've got this thing called a patent cliff. So my background, I'm a patent attorney, but also do IP. But the one area where patents are really relied on is the pharmaceutical industry, is because that's the only way that they can basically make their money back. And they basically patent a new version of a molecule, so a brand new molecule, and they can charge a very high price. But then as soon as that patent runs out, basically the price of the drug will just plummet, because they start making it in India and China. It just becomes like an industrial chemical. And so basically, yeah, you've got a lot of, as soon as the patent on the drug runs out, there's no more incentives to research that drug, and it might be useful for more than one use. So there's huge opportunity as well. about $1.5 trillion worth of savings available from use of off-patent drugs. There's around, could be around 10,000, but at least 3,000, and then there's a bunch of nutraceuticals as well. But none of these areas are basically looked at by private pharmaceutical companies. And so the issue is that, generic drugs, essentially finding new uses for generic drugs are essentially public goods. So if I publish a protocol that shows how to use an off-patent drug to treat cancer, there is no way that I can stop other people from using that treatment as well, because they can just buy the drug from India or China and do the same protocol. So essentially, the information around public goods is information about new uses for generic drugs are is a public good. So it's a public good problem, and also, in order, as I was saying, in order for doctors and patients to actually be able to be confident that these drugs are going to work, they need to have the highest level of evidence, which is these things called randomized controlled trials. Basically, you get half your patients, you put them on one drug, half of them you put on like a control, and you look at how their outcomes work. But unfortunately, those things are very expensive, and that's the reason why only really private pharmaceutical companies are the only ones that will do very large clinical trials, and also the ones that need to get FDA approval. So, as I was saying, also there's huge market failure. A new drug might cost billions of dollars, take over 15 years. But if you're looking at existing drugs and you want to try and find new uses for them, you could actually get a new use within, like, say, 3 years, to get FDA approved, or even less, and it might only cost like basically 1/100th of the price. So, and as I was saying, this is just a similar thing. We're talking about our model, but you might basically you get through to FDA approval a lot faster. And as I was saying, there's massive cost savings for generics because they're basically cents on the dollar. That's sort of essentially chemicals. So massive cost savings, but no way to capture any of that value. So, coming here, people think about public goods funding and donations and grant funding, and then we've got quadratic funding through Gitcoin. But, this could be a really, really good use case for retroactive public goods funding, essentially. So, again, we were talking about hyperserts. That's something we're working on with Gitcoin. They've basically come up with this new project where essentially a hypersert is almost like a carbon credit, but for funding public goods. So, and essentially you can make it any kind of public good you want, and that could include something medical. And in my mind, health is probably one of the most important use cases for crypto, I think, for hyperserts, because even with carbon credits, you'll get people saying, oh, well, climate change isn't real, it's a big conspiracy or whatever. But I think everyone can agree that being healthy is a good thing, and that would be if we had a low-cost treatment that could benefit people in middle and low-income countries and high-income countries, that would be a net good thing and a pretty good use case for this hyperserts concept. That's a little bit more complicated. Obviously, the hyperserts framework, basically they have an agreement that there's an impact, so you can measure any way you want the impact. And one ways that we would say measure impact would be to say there's a clinical trial that was effective, and you have a number of impact points assigned to your hypersert according to how well your clinical trial does. And then you have evaluators, and that's done through obviously through the clinical trial. And then that way the people that basically fund that clinical trial, which would traditionally probably not be pharma, but could be impact investors, will get an outcome payment. And so this is similar to what we're also looking at, which is a way of simplifying that model is just to call it a pay for success contract, or essentially like a prize or a bounty, basically. So, you have a payer, say, if you do this public good, if you prove that this off-patent drug will work, then we will pay you X, $10 million, let's say. And then on that basis, there might be a lot of outcome payments coming out of the fund, and then you would have an investor basically investing in the clinical trials, and the payer doesn't take any risk, but the investor would fund the researchers, and if the research is successful, they get an outcome payment. So this one is something that we're quite interested in. I'll just talk about it briefly, but there's also a way for these clinical trials to basically be funded out of immediate cost savings. So I'm really excited by this particular idea. Interventional pharmacoeconomics, it's even worse than my surname, but it's pretty amazing. It's a way of funding clinical trials out of immediate cost savings. So if you can imagine there's a very expensive drug, like I always use ketamine and esketamine as an example. So ketamine is a good treatment for treatment-resistant depression. Esketamine is around $50,000 a year. It's the patented version. If you just put half of your patients on ketamine, half the patients on esketamine, every patient on ketamine is like, say, a $50,000 cost saving, or maybe $100,000 for another drug. And those cost savings are basically used to pay for the clinical trials. So again, it's a way to use financial innovation to do finance, and I think it's a good use case for crypto as well. There's a lot of repurposing opportunities, or just different kinds of drugs, used for breast cancer. Fluvoxamine was an interesting one for COVID. They did a trial in Brazil, 10,000 people, and they found that this drug would reduce risk of death by 90%. It's a very cheap drug, $10 a course. It's as effective as this other patented drug created by Merck, which was called molnupiravir, which the US government paid $1 billion for. UK paid another $1 billion, and fluvoxamine is just as effective. So it sort of shows that there's sort of perverse incentives. Also in psychedelics, cannabis, these are all very low-cost treatments. Cannabis could be a very effective treatment, help with chronic pain. Psilocybin also could be very useful for major depression, but of course very low cost, and so no private incentives to do that research. So this is kind of the idea of what we're trying to do, which is build what we call a medical impact DAO, but essentially it's like a prize fund. You'll sell medical impact NFTs, you raise $5-10 million in the prize fund, 20% gets paid out every year, and on the other side, so that's the retroactive funding coming down, and then there's prospective funding, basically investors basically funding clinical trials, and if the clinical trials are successful, then we put them into IP-NFTs. That's something that Molecule, they're a DeSci organization working on the IP-NFT framework. Basically, you can have NFTs that link to clinical trial data, and then you can invest, or a treatment protocol, let's say, for an off-patent drug. And then if those are successful, they convert into hyperserts and then are eligible for outcome payments under the prize fund. And so the advantages versus traditional grant funding is that the grant funder doesn't need to take on the risk of failed clinical trials. So with this, you have basically a transfer of risk to the public markets who are willing to take on risk, and the traditional funders don't have to take on risk, they only pay for success. So it's potentially a lot more efficient than just grant funding. Also, with IP-NFTs, you can have fractionalized ownership, on-trade trading of clinical trial data, so you can sort of trade these things on the public markets, and then, create a market for something that hasn't existed. A little bit like, as I was saying before, like carbon credits, but if you can imagine like a carbon credit for open source medicines, and then creating like a market for that kind of stuff. And then DAOs can basically essentially provide a way for this, particularly if it's quite disruptive, for it to become a relatively autonomous and something that might be difficult for incumbent organizations to sort of shut down and have it. So it's sort of, it's a way of, protecting against existential threat. I think, personally, funding public good medicines should be a really good use case for NFTs beyond just, visual display and trading art. No offense to any ape holders out there, but I think that's one of the ideas that we have, is basically to purchase an NFT that represents successful clinical trial data, and that will be paid for successful clinical trials. Maybe a dynamic NFT that changes as soon as clinical trials become successful. And something like that we've been working with VitaDAO. So they're a DAO, a DeSci project, probably one of the main ones. They're really focused on longevity, but essentially they're just a fund, and they're kind of looking at the more traditional sort of funding traditional drug development through patents, but we're also working with them on the idea of using pay for success and this open source IP-NFT idea, and to basically fund open source longevity medicines, because basically most of the data around longevity drugs at the moment is around off-patent drugs. So things like rapamycin, NMN, metformin, resveratrol, vitamin D, all these drugs are off-patent, and they could potentially, there could be treatment protocols that might improve healthy lifespan by sort of 5, 10, 20% even, but there's no private incentives to do this research, and we might be sort of 10 to 15 years away before we get a patented longevity medicine, which ironically might not be any better than these existing off-patent drugs. So could be some massive, if you can improve, I don't know, I've heard some numbers being thrown around, but definitely trillions of dollars worth of added value to society and economic benefit if you can sort of improve healthy lifespan by sort of 5 years or something like that. So that's something we're working on with VitaDAO's Longevity Prize, looking potentially at a generic drug repurposing prize. And Dr. Brad Stanfield, he's a New Zealander as well, he's looking at rapamycin plus exercise for improving strength. So this would be a use case to basically have the prize as an incentive, and then there could be an IP-NFT that's issued to Brad, and that would enable him to raise the money, and if the clinical trial is successful, he'll get a payout from that prize. It's something else we're really interested in is open psychedelic medicine NFTs. We've got like an allow list on our website if you guys want to check it out. But again, so as I was saying, there's some very low cost treatments for depression, psychedelics, so ketamine, super cheap, $2 a dose basically. Psilocybin also very low cost. And no real private incentives to do this research, and this could benefit a lot of people. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. And if anyone has any questions, I've got another 5 minutes. Nicholas.
What help do you need to advance this?
Well, I think, basically getting the word out, like obviously, so that's getting if you guys are interested, there's the white list, the allow list is on that page. I think getting people to talk about it, like ultimately the big problem with anything is, with these issues is funding and getting a source of retroactive funding. So, people that are interested in longevity, for instance, or interested in mental health. The benefit of retroactive funding is you don't actually have to, if you were going to give that money as a grant, you're taking on all the risk of failure. Whereas with this, if you could just stake, the funds, it could sit there as a prize. But yeah, I think that's the main issue and particularly, Optimism is also working on retroactive public goods funding as well, so we're going to reach out to them. But yeah, that's typically the issue with impact markets, is finding a retroactive funder that's basically willing to seed the market. Okay, Nicholas.
The biggest unknowns or unsolved problems?
For creating impact markets, or yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there's a lot of unsolved problems beyond raising the funds, but there's some potentially regulatory issues around whether these IP-NFTs are considered securities. But I personally think that it's possible to separate the IP-NFTs, which will be invested by impact investors, and then have these medical impact NFTs, which are definitely not securities. They're basically just people fundraising and putting money to get an outcome. And so I think from that, yeah, you can ring-fence a lot of regulatory risk. Obviously, yeah, it hasn't been done before, so it would be a new thing. You also want to make sure that there's that the rules are very clear. There's no arguments about whether somebody has achieved the prize or outcome. You know, there might be some disputes around whether people think they've won a prize or whether they're eligible to receive an outcome payment or not. But that can be managed just by having really clear criteria. But yeah, it's a new kind of area. Impact markets generally, I think, is something that we've been talking about a lot, and particularly for funding science, but it hasn't really been rolled out yet, and it's an interesting alternative. So I did my thesis on alternatives to the patent system for medicines, and the idea of prizes as alternatives to patents has been talked about sort of since even Russia, 100 years ago, has been talking about using prizes instead of patents. But no one's really done that yet and rolled it out. So there's actually, in the States, they have the US government agencies have the right to do prizes up to $50 million without Congress approval. So they've kind of would join with X Prize, which is this kind of private organization that does prizes. But yeah, for whatever reason, I think people think of prizes as like something you go to the fair and you get a prize, and it's not seen as like a serious policy lever. So yeah, just a bit of inertia, I think, mainly, also institutional inertia. Yeah. Cool. All right, thanks, guys.